Welcome back to Historical Context. Today we continue our unit on the founding of the Middle Colonies, and today we return to the original Middle Colony, and that is Jamestown in the year 1625. Now it has been 14 weeks since we last talked about Jamestown, and there was an entire unit on Jamestown. So for those of you who have enjoyed that conversation and stuck around, thank you and welcome back to talking about Jamestown. And we start today in the year 1625, where the colony saw a great struggle with the pulling of the Virginia Company's charter. Jamestown became a royal colony, and it was no longer to be supplied by privateers. What's worse is the king who had pulled the charter, King James, died, and his son King Charles I now had to deal with Virginia. And the colony really, frankly, needed to stand on its own now more than ever. The 1625 census showed Jamestown's population at 1,232, with 23 being African slaves. According to a book written by William Washburn, Charles I established a royal monopoly over the purchase of tobacco from the colonies and negotiated pricing with the farmers. That's right there in Jamestown. This was a long, drawn-out negotiation with the House of Burgesses siding with the planters, because many in the House of Burgesses were planters. The House actually met in 1625 and issued a petition to Charles I requesting supplies for the colony, declaring the colony in a miserable state, and asking that he avoid a trade monopoly. They wanted to have other options. Former Governor George Yeardley sent a short petition to the king in October 1625, where he stated the colony was, quote, in great distress and ready to utterly perish. He requested supplies, emphasizing ammunition and apparel. Francis Wyatt, who was the royal governor at the time, had personal matters to tend to in England and was granted leave from his post. Charles I ends up naming George Yeardley as governor, making this Yeardley's second stint. The Crown provided a response to Yeardley's petition and his orders as the new royal governor in a single document. Let's have a look at the writing. To, quote, continue the same means that formerly was thought fit for the maintenance of the said colony until we should find some more convenient means, upon mature advice, to give more ample directions for the same, and reposing assured trust and confidence in the understanding. Basically, Charles I there is saying, sit tight. Yeardley was given the authority to make war and peace with the natives. The Crown also nominated John Harvey to be Yeardley's deputy governor. Harvey was currently in England at the time of that nomination. In a May 1626 letter, some Jamestown leaders appealed to the lords in England for 1,200 pounds sterling to buy palisades and houses to defend their colony against the natives. In October 1626, Governor Yeardley and the council approved a mandate that all dwellings must be paled by May 1st, 1627. And when I looked up paled online, I saw a combination of things. And I think what Governor Yeardley was wanting wasn't necessarily a fence around people's houses, but I think he wanted some type of barrier like you see where the sticks stick out diagonally with a point on the end. I think that's what they were wanting each house to have by May of 1627, to protect themselves from the native threat. At the same time, the Virginia General Court was busy handing down punishments. And this is interesting because it'll give you an idea of what people did that you would consider a crime and how they were punished in that period of time. A man by the name of Henry Carman, who was an indentured servant, his 7-year term was set to expire in 1626, but he was ordered to restart his 7-year term as an indentured servant because he got another servant named Alice Chambers pregnant. A warrant was issued for Miss Chambers to appear before the court on the charge of whoredom and to receive her punishment. Margaret Jones and Robert Hutchinson had an affair. The General Court ordered Margaret Jones to, quote, be dragged by a boat's stern in the river to the shore. Wow. Mr. Hutchinson, who was a repeat offender, was ordered to pay a fine of £40 and to post bond of £300 tobacco. Sounds like Mr. Hutchinson got the better end of the deal. In August of 1627, Yeardley orders a surprise attack of various native tribes in the region. It is not directly reported in any primary sources, but based on indirect information that I reviewed, the attacks seemed to be tapered down due to a lack of ammunition. And that would make sense considering it was something they were desperately requesting from the Crown. Interestingly, the official record, the Virginia General Court record that is, states that the incident was actually an attempt by colonists to destroy the natives' corn supply. So the Virginia General Court, in their documentation, say that colonists went out to destroy natives' corn supply, and that was probably designed to drive them further from the colony, but these historians have come along and said that there was an attack of the natives in late 1627. And that very well may have happened, and there may be primary sources out there indicating it, but I couldn't find those. During the same month, August 1627, a royal proclamation was issued barring the growth of tobacco in England and the importing of foreign tobacco. So the Virginia colonists are now granted their own monopoly in England. The king also required a license to import tobacco from the colony. In November, the king sent correspondence to Governor Yeardley in which he noted that the colony was over-reliant on the export of tobacco. So tobacco was too much of the colony's exports and the colony's economy at the time. He noted in a letter that the economy was, quote, built on smoke. The king requested that the colony begin growing in the industries of making pitch and tar from pine trees, making soap ash and potash, as they were also in high demand in England. So the king's telling the colonists, hey, why don't you guys build things that we need in England? And in fairness to the king and his request, the pine trees were in such ample supply where the colonists were, it wasn't totally an unreasonable request. The Attorney General in England followed up with a new letter dictating new regulations for how tobacco was to be grown. Unfortunately, by the time the letters arrived, Yeardley was not there to read them, as he had just died earlier that month. Yeardley was replaced by Sir Francis West. He, if that name sounds familiar to you, he was the brother of Thomas West, the late Baron de la Warr. West would marry Yeardley's widow in March of 1628. Prior to coming to Jamestown, West served for the Council of New England in the early part of the decade, so he has experience up in the Plymouth area. Now, West had to deal with the demands of King Charles to diversify the colony's economy. Fortunately, he had help. The king, and this is interesting for 1628, the king directed an assembly of representatives to come together in the colony to handle his proposals. That's fascinating considering just a year later, the king would dismiss English Parliament. So clearly here the king is not totally against a legislative form of governance, because he's calling on Virginia to form that legislative branch to meet and to discuss. But just a year later, he would shut down his own legislative branch in England. The assembly thanked the king for the monopoly of tobacco in England, but countered with offering £500,000 at 4 shillings delivered to London, or for permission to sell to other countries like Ireland if the crown saw that proposal unfit. So basically what they're saying is, if you're going to do this, this is what we need you to buy, and this is how much we need you to buy it for. And if you can't do that, we would really like permission to sell to other people. The assembly stated that the limits of cultivation suggested by the king would not be enough to support themselves, and that the other industries required large amounts of capital to enter, while tobacco was low cost and high profit. On the issue of other industries, the assembly had an interesting response. Let's take the pitch and tar, for example, and let's look at the writing. There are materials plentifully for the making thereof, but we find that our weak abilities will not enable us to fully accomplish that work. So there may be pine trees everywhere, but we do not have the skills to produce what you're asking. A very interesting stance, an odd showing of humility from a colony that has quite frankly been rather prideful over the last almost 2 decades. The assembly appointed Sir Francis Wyatt, who was in England. Remember, he's the former governor. He's now in England, and 2 Virginians to go over and represent the colony in negotiations with the king. They were given 6 pence worth of wiggle room on that 4 shilling price. So they were directed that they could go down as far as 6 pence. In September, King Charles renews the privileges that were provided to Virginia farmers by his father, King James. And I didn't see that document anywhere, and I don't recall talking about it, but apparently there were privileges to Virginia farmers that King James provided, and in September, King Charles renewed those privileges, and that had to be out of a showing of good faith, because he's still negotiating with these people over tobacco and price. Ultimately, in March of 1629, so we're into the next year, Francis West is replaced as governor by Sir John Harvey, who had come over from England to serve. Sir Harvey will create all new problems that we will talk about in future episodes. Now, what's interesting here is that Francis West, in some writings, is referred to as a deputy governor, interim governor, before Harvey could come over. And in others, it's suggested that he was elected. I mean, he served that role for a little over a year. And frankly, it's not totally relevant to the story, but I just wanted to point out that that may be a discrepancy you see if you decide to study this particular point in time. I think it's important here to make 2 distinctions. One is that King Charles I is fighting the same battle that Christopher Columbus fought 130 years earlier. And if you think about that, you got to go back to our Columbus unit. It's the first 7 episodes of this podcast. Almost a year ago, or almost precisely a year ago, is when that debuted. Christopher Columbus had a group of men who wanted to mine gold, and that's all they wanted to do. And Columbus said, look, guys, you need to focus on other items to maintain the colony. It can't be all about mining. You have to produce food, for example. You have to find ways, other things other than just mining, to make the colony work. That was a big battle that Columbus fought and lost. King Charles is trying to do the same thing by telling the Jamestown colonists, you need to be doing things other than just tobacco, because it puts the colony's eggs in one basket. And the second distinction I wanted to make, and I kind of already alluded on it, is that King Charles appears to have a much better negotiating relationship with the planters of Virginia than with the people in his own government. Rift lines are going to get very deep in England as we go on, and we're going to see how that affects the colonies. I'm not 100% sure yet, so we're going to learn that together. In September of 1629, George Calvert would arrive in Virginia, and his presence there is what would lead to the series of events that would create a new competing colony with Virginia. And we'll talk more about that next time on Historical Context.